Welcome to Bullshit the Podcast. This is the podcast where we talk every week about how behavioral finance can impact your financial decision making and about how the financial services industry shifts your attention to make you feel more bullish. My name is John DeGuy. I'm the host of the podcast and the author of the book Bullshit. My guest this week is Coreen Sol. Coreen's been an award-winning portfolio manager and a speaker who discusses behavioral finance and effective practice management just like I do. I'm in many ways surprised that I hadn't come across Coreen before now. She joins us today from her office in British Columbia, and I want to welcome you, Coreen.
Thank you, John. It's a pleasure to be here.
The first thing that I want to do that I neglected to do in the introduction was to also point out that you are the author of a book called The Unbiased Investor. You've got a copy there behind you, and it's wonderful. I've had a chance to skim it. Maybe you can hold it up for the people at home so they can see what it is that they should be looking for if they head over to Amazon.com or head over to a bookstore. There
So
it
here
is.
is the self promotion here, and yeah, it's available at your favorite bookstore.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Let's begin by having you sort of tell your story. I'm wondering if you could tell the people at home about how you got into finance and specifically how you gained the interest in behavioral economics and integrating that into the advice you give.
Well, yeah, okay, that's a bit of a long story. We'll make it a short one. So I have been practicing for gosh, almost 30, a little past 30 years. And when like over all these various market events that have happened over the decades, I just started to see a lot of similarities in the way people were behaving. So what I mean by that is like my own clients were, it would be the same, half a dozen handful of people that would call right at the bottom of the market and say, "Green guy, get me out! I can't sleep. I can't tolerate the volatility." And they would say the same reasons. I can get in later when things calm down. I can't sleep at night. I can't stomach things. The same kinds of excuses. So those were some of the more obvious ones, but then there was more nuanced similarities as well that I saw over managing people's money. And some of them were related to their level of wealth. Some of them were related to their background. But I just saw these sort of pockets. And in fact, this morning I was talking with a client, and she came up with a really cool phrase that calls herself she calls it financial anorexia. And what she means by it is that she just cannot stand to see her wealth deplete, and she just has this kind of panic around it. And I was like, "Oh my gosh, that's such a love the term." And I've seen it in certain groups of people. So anyway, all to say that these sort of pockets of people and people's behavior is consistent and predictable in many ways. And that's why I became really keenly interested in the work of Daniel Kahneman and Thaler and Schiller and these kinds of thinkers through the CFA Institute primarily, and then it sort of caught wildfire from there and went down the rabbit hole. And I just saw so many reasons to integrate it into my practice to reduce bias and the successes that come with that.
I was recently happy to be in an audience where you were the main presenter, and I found your presentation to be quite fascinating. And one of the things that you talked about were what you call the three motivations in terms of how make people make decisions, and which basically how people interpret the world around them, how they can control risk or at least try to, and their natural propensity to want to be right. Could you comment on those things, please? Just in terms of the way people what gets people out of bed and what motivates them, even if they don't know it and even if they don't want to admit it.
Yeah, in studying behavioral finance, and I'm sure you've come across this as well, there's a bevy, there's like a laundry list of various biases that have been quantified and qualified. And And as I was working with those various, anchoring or recency bias or representativeness, I mean, there's so many of these definitions, but they're not really practical. First of all, I mean, if you're just an investor and or even a practitioner, like how do you really approach representativeness? Like, it seems very segmented. And so as I started working with these, I realized that they're all interrelated and that really you can batch them into these three categories: how we try to make sense of the world and the way that our brains process information, then how we try to control risk, and usually at the wrong time and in the wrong ways, and then our propensity to want to be right, and how we can even literally reframe an entire set of circumstances in order to feel better about our decisions. Um, so I kind of reframed all of those various individual behavioral biases into those three categories to make it more usable and more practical, more understandable.
Oh, I want to talk for a little bit more about that last one. People always want to be right. There's an old saying that one of my mentors used to use was, "People don't resist their own ideas." And so, if it's your idea, you want it to be right, and you're sort of rooting for the idea not on its merits, but because you're the author of the idea, and as a result, you become wedded, and you start getting into the escalation of commitment and that sort of thing because you just want to be right. There's a certain amount of identity tied into it. I wonder, do you think a large percentage of investors are like that? Because many investors are also, I don't know, and they come to an advisor and they just say, "You do it," and they don't have any personal commitment other than perhaps their commitment that they've chosen the right advisor.
Well, fair enough. And, I think that 100% of people suffer from wanting to be right. 100%. And you think about cognitive dissonance, and Aesop's fable, and just to give an old school example, the fox that wants to get the grape and the grapes that are too far away, he ultimately says, "Oh, well," the convinces himself that the grapes aren't any good anyway. So, kind of making yourself feel better about your decisions. So we match our behavior, our the execution of our behavior. We will literally change our thoughts about something and convince ourselves that our behavior is the right thing that we're doing. So I've come to think about that in a different way though. When people are invested in a market and they're concerned or they're anxious or they generate these feelings that cause sort of an internal distress. And all we're really trying to do is calm that distress, physiologically. So we make decisions around that. That's part of the I can't sleep at night or what have you. And that's what I think about when I say, that we want to be right. We will reframe the whole scenario. And so when it comes to investing, some of the things that can happen is, you will pull out when it's volatile, or, similarly, you don't invest, stay in cash too long because you don't know, but you have a whole bunch of reasons as to why you're making these choices, even though it's damaging your financial objectives. So, and your long term, if everybody in a perfect world, I think you would understand what your values are and make long term plans and stick to those plans. But what happens is behavior gets in the way and causes us to shorten our time horizon suddenly. And volatility makes you stop contributing, or it makes you not want to invest, or makes you sell something, buy something else, something else that's maybe looks more successful in the moment, and shortens your time horizon suddenly and inefficiently.
Decisions are the sort of thing that are with us every day. We all make decisions what to have for breakfast and what to wear to work, and some things are rather more consequential. But one of the other things that you talk about in your book is steps to limit judgment errors when making decisions. And I'm wondering if you can share some of those tips for us, please.
Yeah, so going back to those sort of three central themes of, how we understand the world, how we try to control risk, and how we want to be right and we reframe to our detriment sometimes. Um, so in any of these circumstances, if my goal in life is to promote the idea that we should have a good understanding first of who we are and what we come tooled with and what our objectives are and what our hopes and desires and dreams are. Once you determine that, you can make long-term decisions. So what I'm trying to do is mitigate the short-term transactional decisions that we do on the fly. Those are historically and typically fraught with all kinds of bias because you're caught up in a momentary decision making process. Which, if we can eliminate those, that would be great. And there's, um, you know, I also advocate for making fewer decisions. The less I mean, if you think about it, if you make fewer decisions, you reduce naturally the opportunity for making errors because you're making fewer decisions. So, the chicken and egg thing is, well, how do you make fewer decisions? Well, you make better ones. Well, how do you make better ones? You make ones that are really linked to where you want to be at that future date and not get caught up in that transactional process.
Which leads to, for instance, making monthly contributions to an RSP or a TFSA rather than annual ones, and making things automatic. As soon as you can make things automatic, it allows you to take advantage of dollar cost averaging, but it also allows you the psychological clearance. It gets it out of your head about, oh, I have to save up this $18,000 to put into my RSP in the first 60 days of the year. It's no, no, I'm going to put in $1,500 a month for the next 12 months, and it's just going to happen. And my contribution will have been made by the time the deadline comes. And it's done. And as long as you're diversified and right thinking your principal and your division of assets along the way, everything should logically follow from that.
You're right on, John. Like, you're kind of taking yourself out of the equation. You're setting yourself up for success, and who wouldn't, frankly, rather go golfing or sailing around the world or whatever your passions are, rather than worrying and stressing about, your contributions or how you feel about your financial affairs.
Can you talk also a little bit about making decisions based on your personal values? That when you talk about that, are you talking about impact investing or ESG investing, or are you just talking about having a value of being a more risk-seeking investor and therefore maybe tilting towards small cap value? Or what exactly do you mean when you make investments that are consistent with your own values?
Well, I'm meaning personal values, not like the value, like a valuation of a company, first of all. But secondly, so in my book, I tried to distill, a starting point. There's 8 questions that help people to get that ball rolling. So I wanted to make that really approachable. But values, you can define them in any way that makes sense to you, and everybody is going to have their own sense of what's important, what their own goals are, what their skills are. For example, like, say for example, you have been working in a union for years. You might have skills around understanding pensions really well. Like, these skills can be come from any part of your life. Doesn't have to be just formal education, but it could come from just something your parents taught you. Obviously, some people are more comfortable investing for themselves, whereas other people really need to have, that prevention, that professional intervention, so that they can have, a reliable outcome in their decision making. It's changing tax laws and changing investment landscapes and all of those kinds of things that come into play. But yeah, that's an important component as well.
A lot of that comes down to identity and the way you self-identify. Your bias is very much related to the way you see yourself. I've heard it. I've read in the past that people's identity should be more like your clothes that you can change if you don't like them, rather than like tattoos. Because for some people, an identity
Yeah.
is a sort of, this is who I am, and they make it indelible and they make it irrevocable, and this is absolutely what I'm going to be, and they're not flexible enough to think about, well, maybe I can be someone who likes this other thing as well.
Well, yeah, like maybe green looks really good on you, and you hadn't really considered it before.
Right.
But there is one thing though that is surprisingly not as immutable as you think it is, and that is your risk. Your risk. And so we typically like to think that risk, we categorize people. Yeah, I'm a low risk person. I'm a high risk person, and for the most part, that is comfortable categories in order to guide investment decisions and financial decisions of all kinds. But you should be aware, and most people don't realize this, your risk and your natural tendency to take um, excess risk or be like pull back significantly beyond what your normal risk category might be is directly related to what happened to you last. So, what I mean by that, as a quick example, you might have heard of the house money effect. I'm sure you have. And so picture this, you're sitting at the craps table in Las Vegas, and you've got your, I don't know, whatever your budget is, $100, $1,000, whatever yours is, and you go with your chips and you're playing the round and you win big like right away, and then you take your original, money, put it in your pocket for, that you take your original money off the table, and the winnings we don't identify as ours, certainly not right away. And so, people have a tendency to take additional risk with that they normally wouldn't take with, the money in the pocket, right? That you came with. So this house money effect is kind of funny because, money is fungible and you could just as easily, gamble it all away as pay off your mortgage. So, but that would be an unusual thing to do, right?
I'm wondering if you could maybe help us with maybe just one or two or at the most three little hacks that you can come up with to help people to self-identify their own bias, to see bias in their own behavior, and then to make better decisions as a result of that self-assessment. Is that even possible? Can you think of something?
Well, there's a lot of biases, and I know you've done a lot of work in this area, but just even for a layperson to just take a look at, one day in their life. Like for example, I had a conversation with a client this morning who I had a lot of meetings this morning. And he says, "Oh, I was reading in the newspaper. It's an online newspaper now, but and it's called it's a the dogs stars and dogs. I'm sure you've heard of
Mhm.
it.
Yeah.
So, and he says, "Oh, they say that Dollarama is a star and it's going to go up and blah 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 blah." And I said, "Oh, that's interesting." And he says, "Yeah, I think that they're doing a great business, and I go to Dollarama all the time, and therefore I think we should put it in the investment portfolio." And I said, I, I I hear you, but this is a prime example of how people fall into bias all the time. And just because a business is a good business doesn't mean it's a good investment. So it could be trading at ridiculously high multiples because it's a good business and everybody's jumped on board and pushed the share price up to astronomical values based on expected growth. But that may not necessarily transpire and it may not be a suitable investment for your objectives. So just because a business is something that you subscribe to, or it's doing what you ascertain to be good service or good products or what have you, it doesn't mean that it's a good investment. So that's where that analytical piece has to come in and the awareness, like you point out, of biases. So let's see. How could you easily I think the familiarity of the biases themselves are necessary in order to identify them for sure. And so that's where having some resources at hand is a good idea.
Okay, so here's an idea. I know that you've advocated this in the in the past, and that's the use of checklists. If whether you're working on your own as a do-it-yourself investor or with an advisor or a portfolio manager, you can have someone else administer the checklist, or you can do it yourself. But perhaps you could give us some examples of the sorts of things that you would put on a checklist to help you to self-identify, monitor your own behavior, and then double back. It's ironic we're now releasing the podcast in January and everyone's making a New Year's resolution. I always marvel at how few people check to see how they did with their 2023 resolutions as 2023 rolls to a close. Everyone's all full of energy and good intentions in January, but who closes the feedback loop and actually checks in at the end of the year to see how successful they were in actually following through on the things that they committed to so very earnestly 12 months previously?
Well, and I think you'll notice this bias. If you did really well, you are going to check it more closely
Uh-huh.
than if you didn't. So that's a natural tendency to want to blush away. And there's that reframing thing, wanting to be right. You blush away the past things that hadn't really worked out, and you excuse yourself, and then you celebrate the things that you did do well, and that's just reaffirming and that's nurturing that feeling, that physiological feeling of happiness and success, and uh, pressing away those feelings of discomfort. So you're right on with that. So checklists, like I sitting down and building the checklist is, I think, the most critical part, rather than it's almost secondary to the goals. um, and checklists can be something, and you mentioned automation earlier. Automation is brilliant. Take yourself out of the equation. And I always say, one of the things that's critical to investment, success long term, is stop checking the souffle. Like, if you set it up to be successful, whether, you've talked about dollar cost averaging, or, if you've got an active management mandate with a professional, or you're simply invested in a broad index that's going to do the work for you in a passive way, which I also advocate for. Um, Stop checking the souffle, like, because all it does is invoke emotion, invoke those short-term transactional decision making processes that blow you up. That the more transactions you make in your portfolio, the more opportunity there is for errors in judgment, trading, transaction costs, on and on and on. So, um, checklists are brilliant because they help you stick to the knitting. I think that's the most brilliant way to put it.
The carpenter's rule has always been measure twice, cut once. And as long as you are certain in what your objective is at the outset, then as long as you're careful, you're fine. And the other line that people hear all the time is that a portfolio is like a bar of soap. The more you touch it, the smaller it gets. And so if you can keep your hands off it, you'll do well to simply um, resist the temptation to check the souffle. And I have to tell you, I've never heard check the souffle before today. So thank you for that little nugget because I'm going to use it going forward if you don't mind. That's wonderful. All right, Corrine, we got to wrap this up here. So I'm wondering if we could just get to the end here. The last little bit is where I always ask my people to comment on two things. And the first is something I call that's bullshit. Is there something in the financial services industry that perhaps makes people too optimistic, and that you think is something that could be done differently and hopefully better? What would that be if that was up to you?
Well, I've been around this business for a long time, and I'm also involved, sort of at a national level, on the board of directors of CFA Societies Canada, and that's an advocacy organization for investment integrity across the country, for all investors. And we get involved in regulatory business and things like that too. So I have a pretty good overview of, that's the perspective I'm coming from. And I think it's really confusing to the end user of professional services in this business. It's not to the standard of, like accountants. There's there's a barrier to entry. It's a profession, and like it's a true profession. Whereas in the investment industry, there's like a whole gamut of various qualifications and ways you could participate in this. And I think it's really confusing. I would prefer. So, am I allowed to give my my recipe for a solution here?
Yes, you are. Okay, so let's use that then as the that's bullshit part. Let's move quickly then to the solution part, which is shift happens. It was up to you. How would you deal with the lack of consistent professional designations and consumer awareness of who's who and what's what in the financial services industry?
Well, if I was elected king of queen of this process, I would really like to see the investment industry be a true profession. So, I think highly of the CFA program and its worldwide recognition and quality for um, ethics and integrity. And I mean, gosh, the program is pretty robust. I would like to see something of that ilk. That all investment professionals that practice would reach. In the same way, in the financial planning, the CFP designation is really the cream of the crop. There's other ones out there. I realize, but if there could be an integration where, and maybe all the different bodies that produce these licensing could come together and have something that's a higher level of consistently applied designation for practicing in Canada. I think that would really elevate the professionalism and produce better results for investors at large and reduce a lot of the ambiguity.
You're a woman after my heart. My first book, The Professional Financial Advisor, talked about precisely that, about how we need to be a profession as advice givers in Canada. And for me, I've been doing volunteer work very similarly with FP Canada with regard to the CFP designation. So again, it seems as though we follow these parallel paths, and it's only in late 2023 and early 2024 that we've actually sort of intersected and gotten to know each other. So it's been a real pleasure. Coreen, thank you so much for joining me today. I'm so glad you could make it.
It's such a pleasure, John. Thanks for having me.
John DeGooey is a portfolio manager in Toronto and the author of the book Bullshift: How Optimism Bias Threatens Your Finances. Bullshift is available online and in bookstores everywhere. The opinions expressed in this podcast should not be construed as investment advice. Bullshift, the podcast, is produced by TalkShoe, a division of IOTM.